Thank you, Liz. Great questions to end this part of the discussion with and move into our Q&A. I would really want to pause for a minute, though, and ask us all to give a round of applause to our amazing panelists. I've at moments been appalled by some of the stories, but mostly been really inspired by what we've heard so far. And there's clearly among this group no conflict among art, craft, and science, but what comes through the most is the deep complexity that teaching is, and that we have to recognize and figure out how to support. And when I think about Andrea and Liz's stories, and instead of taking folks like this and saying, how did you have such a remarkable career, and how can we make that possible for other people? What can we learn from it? When you come to a venue like this, you ask yourselves the question and present it for all. Here's what kept me from quitting. Here's what kept me from quitting. How do we reach a point where that's the question that we're asking? What keeps you from quitting? So we have a lot of questions. Let's see how many we can take. And we may want to, I'm going to try and save a few minutes at the end for Tony and Andy to ask Andrea and Elizabeth a question. So let's see if we end up having time for that. Okay. First thing. How does or should the art, craft, science of teaching ensure that equity issues in education are effectively addressed? So, knowing what we know about the art, craft, and science, how do we address equity? Anybody want to take a crack at that? And please use your mic when you speak.
Sure, I'll start.
Thank
And
you.
of course, the focus of my, I would like to believe that equity was always integrated into my lesson teachings. Because of the first year's experience at my first school, the lesson I took from that experience, being denied a position because I was a female, and of course having to actually file a complaint and to get the position. But at the mid-year, did the same thing for the girl students in the school who were denied access into classes such as construction, manufacturing, graphic arts. They were only allowed to take cooking and sewing. And of course, I thought, even though I knew that it would create problems for me, it was important for me to do that because I wanted to send the lesson to the girls, the females, that you have the power to change unsatisfactory conditions in your school, even at this age. But also began to see my classroom as a laboratory for social justice. And I actually began to live that through my students. It was sort of like I would say a cowardly way of addressing social issues by teaching them how to do it. And the writing project was the key to talk for students to have a safe place to talk about practices, structures in their schools that were not equitable, how boys and girls were categorized, courses that each were allowed to take, even in situations where we decide who gets called on, how we line up students, how do we recognize them, how do we acknowledge them, males, females, students of different racial or ethnic backgrounds or class backgrounds. All of that should be taken into consideration and can be addressed in the classroom. We can talk about it outside of the classroom, but where the rubber meets the road is actually in the classroom, where you have students who are being influenced by your actions and are learning from not only the lessons that you're teaching, but they're learning lessons from how you behave and respond to inequities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Liz. Andy, you look like you want to address this one as well.
Thank you. I realise I forgot to switch this off before, so if I've been breathing heavily, I apologise.
No worries.
If you've all been able to hear it. I've been doing a lot of work in the last few years in Ontario, in Canada. Ontario is, and also in Scotland. So I've been advising the Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, until the last election in May, when she was replaced by an overweight blonde man with few qualifications. I think there's a spaceship for them somewhere, by the way. They're sending them all down. And also to Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. And what we're seeing in both those cases and in many others is a shift in how we, indeed they, are thinking about equity. So for 20 years, equity has been predominantly addressed within education as a question of achievement gaps in a limited number of tested areas of achievement in many countries, not just this one, plus some indicators of college readiness and graduation. And that's mainly how we've thought about equity. In a world now of increasing movement of people and emergence of all kinds of other civil rights in a number, language rights, LGBTQI rights, and so on. People are now understanding that equity is now predominantly a question of inclusion and identity. I don't just mean individual identity, I mean collective identity as well. And behind that is the understanding that in a world that is less safe, that is more diverse, that is more where there's a lot more movement, if you cannot see yourself in the school and the curriculum and the pedagogy, it's very hard to be successful in it. If it's a neutral, abstract, all learners pedagogy, then those who are privileged and have Angela Duckworth's grit to be able to survive any teaching, no matter how pitiful, then the privileged know how to deal with this. But if you're not, and you Elizabeth, you talked about the community, how it impacted on you. That's critical. In our most recent book on collaborative professionalism, we look at 5 designs of collaboration in 5 different parts of the world. In all but one of those, which address communities like an Indigenous community in the north of Ontario, working class students in Norway, impoverished students in the rural Pacific Northwest, some of whom are Mexican migrant laborers, some of whom are Indigenous, some of whom are white working class, a group we need to talk about more directly, by the way, a lot more. But one of the things we noticed in all these cases was how much time children and their teachers spent outdoors as well as indoors. That in Colombia, the forests of Colombia, that the forest is part of learning, not is a resource for learning, not an interruption to learning. In the Pacific Northwest, with a network of 34 schools that we've helped them build, the natural and local environment, the place, is part of who they are and is activated. And especially in Indigenous communities, after they'd got some gains, actually, initially, by looking at achievement gaps and raising teachers' expectations to believe the children could learn, the biggest leaps have come subsequently with land-based learning, oral history, narrative, connecting children to their heritage and their sense of place and the strengths of who they are, not just the deficits and the gaps that have to be filled. So I think we're at a moment now in many parts of the world, and I hope soon in this one, where we'll address equity more. We'll measure it. No, don't worry, we really need to measure it.
Yeah.
But as inclusion and identity are not only about gaps in tested subjects.
Absolutely. Tony?
Yeah, one of the improvement science principles, it goes by the label of being user-centered or human-centered, and it's very much inspired by what Andy was just talking about, which is to bring the voices of others into the conversation. Rather than thinking that I know the answer and it's in my head, and if you just did what I think, things would get better. So that is a central part of this work. And I totally resonate with the comments that Andrew was just saying about got to expand this, what we think of, what does it mean to educate well all of our young people. I've written a lot about that over the years. But whatever it is we seek to accomplish, we still have to ask the question, how do we know whether we're getting there? Whether we're doing any good, and for whom, and for whom not. So at some level, these do eventually become things we have to count. And what we have to do is we have to broaden what we look at, and we have to be very careful about how we interpret this evidence. And so this idea of evidence informing, but you can't, however we frame the equity question, it's about all our children. So in some sense, you got to see all of them, rather than just, I can tell you about this wonderful exemplar over here, or this wonderful school over there. As so long as we operate under a tacit norm that everyone has to figure this out on their own, you will see very wide variability in outcomes, whatever outcomes you're looking at.
Yeah.
And the haunting problem is, who do you think is going to be most likely at the negative tail of that distribution? And what kinds of contexts are going to be down there? And so what I tried to argue this morning is that I think it is critical that teachers reclaim and take ownership of the science part of their profession. We feel very comfortable talking about the art and craft part, but you don't want to give the science part away to somebody else, because
That's right.
you'll get that evidence-based practice. You'll continue to get the things that have frustrated very good teachers. And so it's not that it's, and there's, of course, there's a very careful balancing act, but the only way to assure that that balancing act occurs with some integrity is if teachers are central actors in the work rather than having it done to them. And
Yep.
so that's, I mean, that is what, in trying to articulate what a science of improvement looks like, how that enables professional capacity to form, how these concepts of a collective enterprise, they all run through this framing, which is very different than the framing of science that Andy has quite rightfully criticized. I'm really offering a very different view of what a science of educational improvement would look like, and how people work within it, and the roles that educators play inside of it.
Absolutely. We got quite a lot of thoughtful questions here, and obviously thoughtful answers. So it wouldn't be a conversation at AFT without a question about standards. So whoever put in the standards question, thank you. And the question is it possible to have national standards that don't reinforce a scientific management model? Are there some countries that use standards in more enlivening ways than others? So, kind of an international comparison question, but more than that. Anybody want to jump on that one?
I will take a shot at that. And I do recall it in one instance here in the district, we had a superintendent who decided to adopt a new strand of standards called Applied Learning Standards. I was excited about it, mainly because I thought that we needed to look for multiple measures, look for various indicators of success. And of course, the standards, the network of applied learning standards developed by an organization called New Standards allowed students, there are several school districts, one in particular, Seattle, Washington, that adopted those standards. It allows students to show evidence of what they've learned in various ways. One that was of interest to me was portfolio exhibitions that allowed students to actually develop projects. A lot of the work was performance-based. But that would be one area that comes to mind when I think of the standards that we've adopted and what's missing. And of course, because we had a change in leadership, naturally those were discarded. Yeah.
Wow. Anyone else on the helpful standards question?
Well, I think at least a couple of the examples I talked about, the National Writing Project work is a good example of this. They're using the standards to create a common language around which a professional community is working to try to improve their work. And this idea of a common language is really central to the work of a professional capacity. We have a way of talking about what we like to see happen in classrooms, as distinct from, we have an educational enterprise that tends to be defined by cacophony. It's kind of the idea du jour, and you can't really move forward in any collective sense if we can't have some collective ways of talking about what it is we're trying to accomplish. So in its best, that's what I think the standards work as it gets taken up by educators can add.
Mm-hmm. So, whether art, craft, or science, this writer contends, all things are learned best from other practitioners. Many things in art, craft, and science. So, yet most schools don't make time for this. How do we structure school time so that teachers are free to learn from each other? I know a lot of practitioners who struggle with that on a daily basis, but it's not. How do we do it? And I know both Tony and Andy have looked at that in their work at various points.
Tony and Andy to talk about how it's done in the highest performing countries.
Yeah,
That's what I'd like for you to be.
that would be interesting.
Yes,
Yeah.
the amount of time spent in the classroom teaching as opposed to the amount of time spent with teachers collaborating and planning.
Okay, so the way to start this is by saying in a book I wrote in 1995 called Changing Teachers, Changing Times, which I discovered recently is the second most cited book on teaching by a living author. So I'm feeling really old now. Do you know what the other one is?
No.
Yeah, it is. So Dan Lorty, school teacher. Yeah, I'm thinking of sending people to rub him out so that I'll be number one then, basically. But so that was all. It originated from a study of teachers' uses of time. I studied two school districts. One, because people said teachers don't collaborate because they don't have time. So we studied. So the unions bargained with the government for more preparation time, planning time for elementary teachers. We studied two school districts. One where they had a focus on collaboration, and one where they didn't. And the one where they had a focus on collaboration, there was more collaboration, but not all of it was good. Some of it was what we call contrived collegiality. The district that had no focus on collaboration, no leadership, they didn't collaborate anymore. So time of itself does not guarantee greater collaboration of itself. Then we were able to see a few years later, both in New York State and in Ontario in Canada, in a study funded by the Spencer Foundation, that when you brought in standardization and testing and took away teachers' time, they collaborated less. So, time does not guarantee teachers will collaborate more, but take away time in various ways. Increase class sizes is one way to do it. Put people back in front of the kids more is another way. Absolutely guarantees that teachers will collaborate less, and this is why governments do it. It's a strategy.
Yeah.
It's not an accident.
I
It's
agree.
because totalitarian governments don't like educators to intellectuals, actually,
right.
to collaborate. The high-performing countries all have greater time so the TALIS studies for OECD show that American educators are some of the most poorly provided for in the world in terms of time for professional development. And some of that time is pitifully spent. So we know from a study from Boston Consulting about 3 years ago that the most liked professional development strategy for administrators was professional learning communities, and the least liked professional development strategy for teachers was professional learning communities. Because people were being forced to sit in teams together,
Yes.
implementing stuff which had no value for them and was often alien to what they believed in. So there's two problems in America. One is less time than other nations who handle it in various ways, and bad time. So no time, and even when you get it, it's bad time. So it begins to answer your question.
And it actually conjures up another question, because the PISA study also offers recommendations
Yeah.
for U.S. Why is it that we have ignored those?
Yeah.
I don't understand why. And I think you may have answered it when you said totalitarian governments may
Yeah.
not want collaboration.
Yeah.
That helps me to understand why we've ignored those recommendations for years.
And indeed, we have.
Yes.
I could talk about collaboration a bit.
Okay.
So I've found in my school that actually proximity and not so much time is what makes us better at collaborating.
Just space.
Yeah, space, the
Yeah.
physical space. So the
Space.
people that I collaborate with the most are the people that are right next to me. And so my principal is great. He groups us in the building so that the 12th grade teachers are all together, the 11th grade teachers are all together, and then the lower house 9th and 10th grade teachers are together in a space. And so just being able to pop across the hall and say to the history teacher, hey, I'm going to be using this text for the next couple of weeks. Does that link up to anything that you're doing in your classroom? He's like, you know what? Actually, that does. Let's see if we can, use some kind of a common graphic organizer to teach this so that the kids see it repeating over and over again. And that's how collaboration has happened for us. We haven't gotten any more time to do it. We're doing it on our own outside of school hours, borrowing, a bit of time from lunch or before school to do it. But just being near each other is what's making it happen. And I work in a unique position in my school where we teach for 10 months out of the year, but we work 12 months out of the year. And there's only 2 schools in Prince George's County that are international high schools. Mine in Bladensburg, and it's Langley Park, and then in Largo. And so we work those 2 months in the summer, and that summertime, we do have some student-facing time where we're teaching some summer school courses, but we're also collaborating and planning and writing our own curriculum. And so now that this team, because we're only in our 4th year, but now that this team is together and has started to get to know each other a little bit more, like we are putting structures in place so that this summer our attempts at trying to be interdisciplinary with our instruction are going to be more structured. Because right now it's sort of happening organically because we're all close to each other. But our goal for this summer is to map out what's happening over the entire year so that we can cross what's happening in ESOL class with what's happening in English 11th class, what's happening in history class, with what's happening in Spanish for native speakers class, so that it's getting hit over and over and over again. So I think that collaboration, even though time is very important, and we do get that time in the summer, I think just the proximity has helped us a lot.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. And Tony, you want to speak to this?
Back in the middle of the 1990s when I was working in Chicago. In the middle of the 1990s when I was working in Chicago, we were beginning to develop and put in place a professional development school for the City of Chicago Public Schools. And we were going to use the chartering, and we used the chartering vehicle to accomplish this. But at the same time we were doing the development work on this, I had an opportunity as part of a cross-national group to visit schools in China. And at that point in time, China was still considered a third world country. And here I am in this really, what were really poor school context. But one of the things that stood out for me was the teachers had offices. And they all kind of, and the schedules were kind of arranged, so they sort of spent time together. And so when we were designing this space with the Chicago Public School folks for this professional development school, I said to the architects, I want offices for my teachers. I got the K1 I want together, the 1-2 I want together. We had them we had them in groupings, and they looked at me like I was totally crazy. Well, I got desks. Well, yeah, but the desks are in their classrooms. If we want them to work together, I need environments. We did eventually. It took a while, but we did get it. But my point is that you need structures. Yeah. And the other thing we worked on is we really worked on the schedule, because if you prioritize this, teachers did have some, in air quotes, free periods. So you try to arrange them so they could be together in their offices. So even if it wasn't a structured activity, there was a chance, the informal opportunities to interact with each other. And then when you do have structured activities like these school-based professional learning community meetings, this is where you do get into the question Andy mentioned before. This is a place where some good protocols and routines, figuring out what these things are, can really make these practices work better. So I think there are at least a few different elements to actually getting better collaborative practice to occur inside schools, rather than it being, it's got to be something you do outside or it's accidental because of who you happen to be next to in a building.
So since we are almost out of time, I think I'm going to use this question as the question to wrap us up. So, and if anyone wants to share a final reflection in the context of this question, please feel free. So this author says that one element that's in common in art, craft, and science of teaching is the role of reflection. And Andrea, you talked about that a little bit too. Would the panelists discuss the importance of reflection and its capacity to unify the different conceptions of teaching? Anybody want to take any part of that question and wrap it into their closing comment?
So, I think reflection is what makes a good teacher. And I think that I didn't realize that I was a reflective teacher. I have been a reflective teacher my entire career. And I think that's just because that's my personality. But I didn't actually realize that I was a reflective teacher until I actually had strong administration. Because when I worked in the Bronx for those 9 years, we flip-flopped through principals and assistant principals, and I never really had strong, consistent admin. But then when I came to Prince George's County Public Schools, I was in an elementary school where we had a strong administrator, and she made me realize that I was reflective. So I think that to be able to be an effective teacher, I mean, obviously we are looking at the data and like how does that inform what we're doing with our students, but that's being reflective, right? So, I mean, I think that's the whole reason why people are effective teachers, because they're reflecting on a regular basis, on a daily basis, many times a day.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I'm going to have to say that reflection individually at the end of each day was necessary, and the only thing that enabled me to come back each day. It gave me a chance to really think about what went wrong, comments, suggestions made by my students, whether or not I was being fair to all of my students. I often thought about that. I was always careful not to subject my students, males, females, to any category. I wanted them all to believe that whatever it is you want to do, you can achieve it. But the reflection later, after my first 3 years with other colleagues, was more powerful. But reflection happened every day at the end of almost every period. If you had time to think, you would reflect. We were having less and less time to think. I had to think about an exchange program I did in Seoul, Korea, for 1 month, and I walked into the school, the attached middle school in Seoul. The first thing I was asked to do was to report to the teacher's lounge with my teacher partner, and there must have been 150 desks in this lounge. Each one had its own computer. The teacher, every teacher in the school had a workstation. It was nothing like nothing I've ever seen. So when you mentioned that, and of course during the lunch break, we were able to sit in the lounge for an hour. It was just unbelievable to see how it was just a natural process for teachers to be able to collaborate and talk to each other every day. But the reflection happens automatically with the teachers who are concerned about whether or not a lesson went well. If not, what went wrong? What can I do to make it better, more engaging? And then, of course, that's when all of the artistic side of teaching kicks in. If you need to animate a lesson, you can figure out how to do that during your reflective period in the evening or after school. So reflection is just a natural process. Like Andrea said, if you are a good teacher, passionate about what you do, you cannot avoid reflective time alone and with colleagues.
Thanks, Liz. Andy?
I'll go
or
next, so
Andy?
you can go last. How would that be? So first, I'm going to make a public invitation to Tony to write a book for a series I edit called Leading Change. It has Michael Fulham's written a book, a leading expert from Singapore has written a book, Amanda Datnow has written a book, and what I'd love you to do in that book is write 4 chapters which will unite you're like Picasso, your first period, second period, and third period. I don't know which was your blue period, but unite these 3 periods, which I think would unite it for you, but for the world. First, your research on Catholic education and school effectiveness, which, one big takeaway for me about that work and for many people is these are in the better days of Catholic education, of the importance of an inspiring moral purpose that serves all students. That's like number 1. And what would it look like now to take that seriously for all of America? Second, the importance of the collegial and community relationships in building trust so that people have and understand that purpose together and learn how to become more effective in realizing it. And your third question, which is now the major one that's kind of up on your radar, is then so we believe that together. How do we know we're getting there over time? And in each case, what does that mean for America now, and what does it mean when you bring all those 3 things together for America? So I'm asking you to unite yourself, so you can unite the country. That's and in your spare time, I don't know what you'll do, but that's a book I invite you to write, because I think it's a book we need so badly right now. And just quickly Donald Schoen talks about 3 kinds of reflection. Inaction, so you're thinking as you're doing. On action, you think about it afterwards. But there's a third one, which you didn't talk about, which is about action. And I think the problem is in education, we give principals and system leaders the big picture, and we give teachers the big binder. And teachers need to have time and opportunity to be part of and contribute to the big picture as well.
Thanks, Andy. I didn't know we were going to have any challenges thrown down in this session, but we did, and you got the last word, Tony.
Well, now I know what I'm doing in my retirement, so I just got to get there. Yes, on reflection, as being, I think, a unifying activity across art, craft, and science. We are, I've said on occasion, we are by human nature experimenting beings. That is, it's literally in our genome. It's literally how the human species has survived. We try things, they work, if they don't work, we try something else. And the key thing, and that of course is is central to a kind of scientific enterprise we learn through by doing. But one of the things that the kind of scientific angle on it brings into the work is a certain amount of humility, that as human beings, we also tend to all be engaged in some forms of what's referred to as affirmation bias. We tend to see what we believe. And if we're really about improving the work, improving the experiences for children, we have to have some way in which discrepant evidence comes in to challenge us, because otherwise we can keep doing the things we've always been doing, believing in the efficacy of what we're doing, and it's not just happening out in front of you. And so, again, it's part of why I think it's important for educators to rightfully claim the science as part of the craft and the art and the humanity that I think we've heard so eloquently expressed in the work this afternoon.
Thank you, Tony. A great note to end on. I apologize. I've let us go a minute or two over time, but I don't know about you. I think it's truly been worth it. Please join me in thanking Elizabeth, Andrea, Andy, and Tony. Thanks so much, and see you next week, hopefully.